So good afternoon. I'm Michael Rothberg, and on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this discussion and reading with Eduardo Halfon. This event is part of the 1939 Society Program in Holocaust Studies, and I'm very grateful to the 1939 Society and its president, Bill Elprin, for all they've done to support research and public programming at UCLA. I'm also very thankful for the amazing Levy Center staff who make this and all of our activities possible. Please visit the registration table at the back of the room to see more of the Levy Center's upcoming events. At this time, I ask that you please silence your phones. This afternoon's event will unfold like this. For the first 50 minutes or so, Eduardo Halfon and I will engage in a dialogue about his work, and Eduardo will also read some selections from his writings, and then we'll open things up for a discussion with the audience. Let me begin, however, by introducing our guest and his work. As I'll suggest in a moment, one of the effects of Eduardo Halfon's work is to challenge us to think about what constitutes a fact and what separates fact from fiction. Nevertheless, to begin introducing Eduardo Halfon to you, let me just give you a few of the facts. Born in Guatemala in 1971 and raised in part in the United States, Eduardo Halfon is the author of 15 books in Spanish, the most recent of which, Un Hijo Cualquiera, Any Given Son, just appeared in September 2022 and has already been translated into French. Among his books in English are Monastery, The Polish Boxer, Mourning, and most recently Cancíon, which appeared in 2022. All of the English versions are published by Bellevue Literary Press, and most are translated by the talented duo of Lisa Dillman and Daniel Hahn. The English versions often differ in their arrangement of stories from the Spanish originals, maybe something we can touch on later. Halfon has received many awards for his work, including a Guggenheim Fellowship and the Roger Caillois Prize in France. Mourning in particular has received multiple accolades, including French and Spanish prizes, and in the US, the Edward Lewis Wallant Award and the International Latino Book Award. In 2018, he was awarded the Guatemalan National Prize in Literature, his country's highest literary honor. Eduardo currently lives in Berlin. Speaking now in a more personal vein, I've been looking forward to the opportunity to host Eduardo Halfon for some time. In fact, I can date it quite precisely. I discovered Eduardo Halfon's work in 2018 when his novel Mourning was a finalist for the Kirkus Book Prize. The description of the book provided by Kirkus, which hooked me, provides a nice one-sentence account of some of the crucial aspects of Halfon's work. The Kirkus reviewer wrote, "In his latest autobiographical novel, to be translated into English, Guatemalan native Halfon's same-named alter ego continues his far-flung travels to probe hidden family truths dating back to Nazi concentration camps." The connection sketched here between Guatemala and Nazi camps immediately caught my attention, since I'm someone who's always on the lookout for unexpected juxtapositions between Holocaust memory and geographies and histories of violence that seem at first to be far from the epicenter of the Nazi genocide. I ordered Mourning right away and was not disappointed. Indeed, within a few pages of its opening chapter, Senor Hoffman, I knew I'd discovered a provocative and original voice in contemporary literature who spoke to my own concerns about how and why we choose to remember traumatic pasts, whether those of the Holocaust and the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, or more recent episodes of political violence in Guatemala, Yugoslavia, or elsewhere. History and violence are persistent concerns of Halfon's fiction, but at its center, it seems to me, is a paradox concerning identity. On the one hand, all of his stories are anchored by a narrator named Eduardo Halfon, and it's hard not to read his books as autobiographical, as the Kirkus reviewer describes them. Indeed, from what we can deduce, the life of Eduardo Halfon often seems to closely parallel the life of Eduardo Halfon. On the other hand, however, identity is the farthest thing from an anchor of certainty in the worlds Halfon creates. In his stories, the Halfon figure is frequently mistaken for someone else, the eponymous Senor Hoffman, for example, and many of his stories involve futile searches for enigmatic figures, a Serbian Roma pianist, Halfon's uncle Salomon, a Guatemalan guerrilla fighter, or various indigenous Guatemalan children, all of whose fates ultimately remain shrouded in uncertainty and mystery. To give one amusing example, Halfon's most recent book in English, Cancíon, opens with a story called The Conference, in which the narrator is greeted in Arabic, a language he does not know, by Japanese professors in the Tokyo airport. So let me just read one short passage from this short story at the beginning of Cancíon. I had come to Japan to participate in a Lebanese writers' conference. After receiving the invitation a few weeks earlier and after reading it and rereading it until I was sure it wasn't a mistake or a joke, I'd opened the closet to find my Lebanese disguise, among my many disguises inherited from my paternal grandfather, born in Beirut. I'd never been to Japan before, and I had never been asked to be a Lebanese writer. A Jewish writer, yes. A Guatemalan writer, obviously. A Latin American writer, of course. A Central American writer, less and less. A U.S. writer, more and more. A Spanish writer, when traveling on that passport was desirable. A Polish writer on one occasion at a Barcelona bookstore that insists on shelving my books in the Polish literature section. A French writer, since I lived for a time in Paris, and some of people assume I'm still there. I keep each of those disguises on hand, nicely ironed and hanging in the closet. But I'd never been invited to participate in anything as a Lebanese writer. And playing an Arab for a day at a conference at the University of Tokyo seemed a trivial matter if it was going to enable me to see the country. So as you can see here, identity is a central theme of Halfon's work, but it's always a matter of suspicion and skepticism, seems to me. So Eduardo Halfon's fiction is, you won't be surprised to hear it, extremely self-reflexive and self-referential. It's also defined by a kind of recursivity. It returns again and again to certain stories, certain themes, probing them from multiple directions. Despite the gravity of many of the issues Halfon takes up, his work is also extremely funny, sometimes shockingly so, because of the intimacy he glimpses or perhaps creates between tragedy and comedy. I think we're going to have a chance to discuss many of these issues of history, memory, and identity as they play out across his fiction this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming Eduardo Halfon. And I thought we could start with a question that comes directly from the occasion that brings us together and concerns this vexed matter of identity that I was just referring to in his work. This afternoon's discussion is taking place under the auspices of the Leve Center for Jewish Studies at UCLA. That seems appropriate to me. Many of your stories touch on what we could call Jewish themes. At the same time, the Eduardo Halfon figure in your stories often expresses a distance from or even a rejection of Jewish identity and culture. So just to get us going, maybe you could say a little bit about the role that Jewishness plays in your writing as a culture, history, religion, identity, or however you think of it.
Hello, everybody. I don't need this, right? You can hear me? Yeah? I'd prefer not to hold the microphone. First of all, thank you very much to everybody, to Michael for this. I think it was your idea, so thank you for the idea. Thank you to the Levy Center and UCLA, and thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Sunny LA compared to Berlin. It's an honor to be here. First time in UCLA, second time in LA. It's a long ways from Berlin. So excuse me in advance if I'm a little groggy. I'm still on Berlin time. So for me right now, it's I think 4 a.m., but we should be okay. Jewishness. If I may, Michael, I'm gonna expand your question a little bit to Jewishness and Guatemalanness, because I think they're intertwined, these two parts of my identity. A few years ago, a journalist in Spain asked me the dumbest question I'd ever been asked, or what I thought was the dumbest question I'd ever been asked. And then immediately I thought, that's the smartest question I've ever been asked. And the question was as follows: which book that you have not read has influenced more your writing? Which book or books that you have not read have influenced more as a writer or your writing? And I knew my answer immediately. I knew the answer. The Torah and the Popol Vuh. If I may call these two books. And there's a reason for that, I think. I've not read them as books. Obviously, I'm bar mitzvahed, so I've read parts of the Torah, at least phonetically. But for me, it was very important when I started to write to destroy my house. And I think I should explain that. I should probably go a little bit further back. But when I was 24, I moved back to Guatemala. So we left when I was 10, and I grew up in the U.S. I grew up in Florida for school, and then University of North Carolina. And then I was forced to go back because I was always here with a student visa, and my studies ended, engineering ended, and I had to go back. And I went back to a country I didn't know anymore, to a language I could barely speak. I had lost my Spanish. I could understand it because our parents always spoke to us in Spanish, but we would answer in English immediately. And I was lost. I was completely out of place. And the distance I felt with Guatemala, which I think we'll talk about later, I started to feel towards Judaism. This was something that I'd always felt growing up, that I didn't want to behave that way, but I was the firstborn. It was my duty, I felt, to be what my parents wanted me to be, to study engineering, to be a good Jew, to work with my father, which I did when I graduated college. And that time, those mid-20s, early to mid-20s, you're supposed to be in crisis. Mm-hmm. You're supposed to not be that comfortable with life. You have big decisions to make, or you think you have big decisions to make. And for me, it was even worse because I was in a country I didn't want to be in, and I was in a religion I didn't want to be in, and I was in a language I didn't want to be in. And that all pushed me towards writing. First, towards reading. I was never a reader. Never read. Never liked books. Never cared for books. Never understood what all this was. I stumbled onto books by accident. And it was an accident provoked by this sense of frustration. I was very frustrated. I was going through a crisis, an existential crisis. I went to the university in Guatemala after 4 years of feeling this way, getting worse and worse, and tried to enroll in philosophy. I probably should have gone to a psychologist or a rabbi, but I went to the university, and I remember I sat across the admissions officer, a lady, and she said, I can only enroll you in philosophy if you also enroll in literature, because it's a joint degree. In Latin America, it's called letras y filosofía. You have to study both. I said, okay. And I started that afternoon, and I immediately fell in love with literature. Immediately. With stories, particularly. I don't know what it was. It wasn't it wasn't a writer. It was just the feeling of fiction. It was like a buoy. I was drowning, and somebody threw something in the water, and I clung to it. And that something was literature, and I became a reader, just a reader then. And I started reading. voraciously for the next year or two before ever picking up a pen. So Jewishness, to get back to your question, it was around that time that I rejected it. I verbally, physically stood up at a Shabbat dinner and said, I am no longer a Jew. This did not go over well, because I said it to my Polish grandfather who had survived the Holocaust. And what I meant, I think, was not that I'm no longer a Jew. I am a Jew. Of course I'm a Jew. I will always be a Jew. I just don't want to be the Jew you want me to be. So I had to destroy it. I had to destroy my house. If I wanted to be a writer, if I wanted to start expressing my own voice, I needed to destroy the house that I was born in. And that house had two pillars. And those two pillars were Judaism and Guatemala. And that's why I answered what I answered in that interview. The Torah and the Popol Vuh are the two books that have influenced me more. As a man, as a writer, those are the two main parts of my identity, Michael. So only a Jew asks himself why he is a Jew. And I think it's a very Jewish thing to do. No? I don't think Catholics do that. You know, why am I a Catholic? What kind of Catholic do I? No, it's a Woody Allen thing. It's a Seinfeld thing. It's a very Jewish question, and I think it's a very valid question, because there isn't one way to be Jewish. There isn't one correct way to be Jewish. Anybody can enter Judaism and practice Judaism in the way they want to, and that's what I was saying that night. Let me get there. Let me find it. I'll find it. But let me get there. And I found it through writing. My interest in Judaism began when I began writing. Likewise, Guatemala. Yeah?
So one of the ways then that it manifests in your writing is around the question of the Holocaust,
Right.
in fact. And you mentioned your grandfather, or one of your grandfathers, was a Polish-Jewish survivor of the camps. And that becomes then a very central element, one of these recursive elements of your work that you return to again and again. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that and the way you approach the Holocaust in your work. There's, of course, a long history of thinking about the challenges that the Holocaust poses to literary and artistic representation. Adorno, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, this kind of thing, right? It's a very loaded topic, of course. So I'm wondering, this is not what I would call conventional Holocaust literature, and yet the Holocaust is central. So how do you think about those challenges?
I don't think about them, and this is not a joke. It's when I sit down to write, Michael, I sit down to write. I don't think about what I'm writing. My writing process is very spontaneous. I'm very much in the line of a short story writer, not a novelist, so I don't plan this out. I'm just interested in images to begin with, and then trusting those images and letting those images guide me in a way. It's very difficult to describe, because it's nothing what I expected it to be. Nothing. I'm an engineer. I thought one planned this out. But I cease to be one when I'm writing, at least at the beginning. When I'm in the midst of a story, I feel as though I'm writing in the dark. I don't know where I'm headed. I don't know what the story's about. I can sort of sense there's a door there and a window there. But it isn't until the end of the story surprises me, because it always surprises me, that the light comes on. And this is what I've been writing for the past 3 months. That always happens. So when my grandfather's story came up, my grandfather was captured in 30, well, why don't I read a little of that story, or I'll preface it. I'll preface it and then read a little. My grandfather was captured in November of 39, so one of the first to be captured by the Germans and survived. So he was in many camps. And in 1946, he arrived in Guatemala just because a distant uncle was alive there. He was just looking for a relative, found one in Guatemala, and showed up, which is incredible to me. As a Polish man to arrive in Guatemala. And he refused to speak about what happened during those 6 years. For 60 years, he never spoke about it. And so one day, it was late 90s, I asked my mother what camps her father had been in, and she didn't know. So I went to my grandfather. I thought this was incredible. How do we not know, as his grandkids, his story? And I said, Oitse, can we talk? He said, yes. Sit down. And he took out a bottle of whiskey, and we had a 5-hour conversation. Before starting, I said, can I film you? And he said, yes. So I have the video of the first time he spoke. It was still a VHS, these big cassettes. And in those 5 hours, he told me a very small story in about 1.5 minutes about a boxer. And I knew immediately that was the story. It wasn't the biggest story. It wasn't the most dramatic. It wasn't the worst that happened to him. But there was something about that story that immediately appealed to me. And I tucked it away. I plucked it and put it in my pocket and carried it around for the next 7 years. So while I was writing other stories, that story would creep in and then hide again like a frightened turtle. I was afraid to write it. I didn't know how to write it. It probably needed time to just percolate inside of me. I was afraid of not honoring him, of dishonoring him. I was afraid of the reaction that some of my family would have, which came to be true. That happened as well. But finally I wrote that story, and that story turned out to be the title track of this book. The Spanish version was published in 2008, and it was a very, very innocent 95-page book of 6 stories, narrated by the same voice. So it's the same Eduardo Halfon telling these stories. So that's where he was born. That narrator was born in that book with those 6 stories. And at the end of the book, you get the story of the Polish boxer, but it builds up. And I thought that was it. I thought that narrator was done. But then those stories started growing. And one of those stories became The Pirouette, which is a short novel that takes place in Belgrade. Another story became Monastery, which takes place in Israel. Then Senior Hoffman, and then Mourning. And so that original book, that original Polish boxer, started spawning books, in a way. Characters would reappear, stories would continue. And it's become this ongoing project now. It's an ongoing novel. It's a novel in process that I've been publishing as I go along. In Spanish, we're going to publish the 7th book next year, but this was the first. So I'll read the beginning of The Polish Boxer, the first 2-3 pages, so that you get a sense of my writing and a sense of my thinking about the Holocaust. The Polish Boxer. 69752. That it was his phone number. That he had it tattooed there on his left forearm so he wouldn't forget it. That's what my grandfather told me, and that's what I grew up believing. In the 1970s, telephone numbers in Guatemala were 5 digits long. I called him Oitse because he called me Oitse, which means something soppy in Yiddish. I liked his Polish accent. I liked dipping my pinky, the only physical feature I inherited from him, by the way, this pinky, in his glass of whiskey. I liked asking him to draw me pictures, but he only actually knew how to draw one picture, quickly sketched, always identical, of a sinuous and disfigured hat. I liked the beet red color of the sauce, chrein in Yiddish, that he poured over his white ball of fish, gefilte fish in Yiddish. I liked going with him on his walks around the neighborhood, the same neighborhood where one night, in the middle of a big vacant lot, a plane full of cows had crashed. But most of all, I liked that number, his number. It didn't take me too long, however, to understand his telephone joke and the psychological importance of that joke, and eventually, although nobody would admit it, the historical origin of the number. Then, when we went for walks around the neighborhood or he started drawing a series of hats, I would stare at those 5 digits and, strangely happy, play a game of inventing secret scenes of how he might have gotten them. Like this. My grandfather face up on a hospital bed. While straddling him, an enormous German officer dressed in black leather shouted out the numbers one at a time to an anemic-looking German nurse, also dressed in black leather, who then handed him one by one hot irons. Or this. My grandfather sitting on a wooden bench in front of a semicircle of Germans in white coats and white gloves and white lights that fastened around their heads like miners, when suddenly one of the Germans stammered out a number, and a clown rode in on a unicycle, and all the lights shone their white light on my grandfather, while the clown, with a big green marker in ink that could never be erased, wrote that number on his forearm, and all the German scientists applauded. Or this. My grandfather, standing at the ticket booth of a cinema, sticking his left arm in through the little round opening in the glass where they pass you the tickets, and on the other side of the window, a fat, hairy German woman setting the 5 digits on one of those stamps with adjustable dates like they use in banks, and then, as if it was an extremely important date, stamping it hard and forever onto my grandfather's forearm. That's how I played with his number, clandestinely, hypnotized by those 5 mysterious green digits that, much more than on his forearm, seemed to be tattooed on some part of his soul. Green and mysterious until not so long ago. In the late afternoon, sitting on his old butter-colored leather sofa, I was drinking whiskey with my grandfather. I noticed that the green wasn't as green as it used to be, but more of a diluted, pale grayish color that made me think of something decomposing. The 7 had almost amalgamated with the 5. The 6 and the 9, unrecognizable, were now 2 swollen blobs, deformed and out of focus. The 2, in full flight, gave the impression of having moved a few millimeters away from the rest of them. I looked at my grandfather's face and suddenly realized that in my childhood game, in each of my boyish fantasies, I had imagined him already old, already a grandfather. As if he'd been born a grandfather, or as if he'd aged once and for all at the very moment of receiving that number, which I was now examining so meticulously. It was in Auschwitz. At first, I wasn't sure I'd heard him. I looked up. He was covering the number with his right hand. Drizzle purred against the roof tiles. This, he said, rubbing his forearm gently. It was in Auschwitz, he said. It was with the boxer, he said, without looking at me and with no emotion whatsoever and speaking in an accent no longer his own. I would have liked to ask him what it felt like when, after almost 60 years of silence, he finally said something truthful about the origin of that number. Ask him why he had said it to me. Ask him if releasing words so long stored up produced some liberating effect. Ask him if words stored up for so long had the same taste as they rolled roughly off the tongue. But I kept quiet, impatient, listening to the rain, fearing something, perhaps the intense transcendence of the moment, perhaps that he might not tell me anything more, perhaps that the true story behind those 5 digits might not be as fantastic as all my childhood versions. Yeah?
Thank you. So the way the Holocaust appears in your work, to stick with this for a little bit longer, if we could, on the one hand, it's a family story, right, that comes through in this, often very intense way, and these kind of very intimate encounters between you and your grandfather. But the Holocaust is also present in your work as, at least in certain moments, as a kind of public memory. And there your approach, I think, shifts a bit, it seems to me. So I'm thinking, for example, of Senor Hoffman, which is the first story included in Mourning, in the English version of Mourning, where the narrator is on a train, and we don't know, in Italy, and we don't know why, and then he arrives finally at his station, and he's met by someone, and that person says, now I'm going to take you to the concentration camp. And it's a kind of a shocking moment, and then you realize, okay, he's here to give a talk, to give a lecture at a camp memorial site, and you get to the memorial site, and then it turns out it's not really a concentration camp, it's a reconstruction of a concentration camp. It's a fake concentration camp in a certain sense. So there's a kind of, you're very attuned to the way it seems to me that the Holocaust gets appropriated, let's say, in public discourse and public memory. And there's something which I appreciate a lot about your work, which is, I would describe as impious, right? There's a lot of piety around the Holocaust, and with good reason, and there are aspects of that in your work too, again, I think, in some of the stories about your grandfather, but there's also, a kind of parodic side as well.
Yes.
A parodic and impious side. I could give other examples, but I don't want to give away too much. Is this something you see in your work? Is this something you're consciously doing?
Absolutely. I love your question. I love your comment. I love the word impious. I've never used that word. I always say a lack of solemnity when writing about these things, but impious is probably more precise. And there is a parody element to it. This story is based on a trip that I took to Italy, to southern Italy, to Calabria, to give a talk at this camp, and it was as described. They had destroyed it because the freeway had to go through there, and then they rebuilt the camp. But it's worse than that. They didn't rebuild it. There's no they. It was a guy, and he charged admission. He would stand at the door and charge admission. So there were schoolfuls of kids coming in, paying to visit this sort of theme park. It was incredible. My relationship with concentration camps is very, very ambivalent. I don't know what to think about that. It's going to Auschwitz was not what I expected it to be. I couldn't wait to leave. Maybe I was there on a bad day, but there was just too many American high school students singing and making fun, and then Sachsenhausen, which is where my grandfather was at. Again, very, very ambiguous about but how do you honor that memory? What do you do? And now I'm on the other extreme, right? Because I'm in Berlin, which is the opposite. It's like living in a concentration camp now, or in a big museum, because you cannot not notice all the effort that they're doing in trying to make amends, to remember, I don't know what the right expression is, but it's everywhere in Berlin. The plaques on the floor, and the plaques on the walls, and the museums, and it's like living inside a Holocaust museum for a Jew. No, so that's the other extreme. My reaction to all of that when I write is to use humor. Whether it be sarcasm or humor, more of a parodic, I think is the word you used. And I was criticized for it by a German literature critic.
Of course.
One of the most important literature critics in Berlin, when the Polish Boxer was published in Germany, said, "You can't do that. You can't use humor when talking about the Holocaust." And I said to him, "That's exactly when you should use humor. That's precisely when you need humor. I can see a Jew inside Auschwitz making jokes. It's just part of who we are, to make fun of a heavy situation. When it gets really solemn, we need humor. And we know that. But for some reason, for the Germans, that's not allowed. I think it is. I think it's necessary. So it's very tricky, and I'm trying to write something about that now as I'm there, as I'm in Berlin, because I can't escape it. I don't want to escape it, but I couldn't even if I wanted to.
That does sound very much like a German response. I'm not surprised. Not surprised to hear it entirely. And I do appreciate that dimension of your work quite a bit. Moving now a little bit, starting to move a little bit away from the Holocaust, but not really leaving it behind. I was struck when you described the Polish boxer and how this began and how this whole project, in a sense, began. You talked about the Polish boxer as kind of spawning more books.
Yes.
And so things sort of spiral out from that initial story.
That's right.
And one of the ways that those things spiral out, and one of the things that you seem to spawn, is what I've called in my own thinking a multi-directional kind of memory, a multi-directional sensibility, which is to say that your stories bring together multiple and often very different histories of violence. So we find not just the Holocaust, but also there are lots of references to Japan and to Hiroshima.
Yes. In Cancíon, especially because it begins in Japan.
Yeah, but also in Mourning, right? You switch from the concentration camp to a memory about visiting a memorial site in.
But that's very interesting. I'll interrupt you and then I'll let you finish. That page in Mourning, where we visit a bombed out school with a wall. There's a black wall that was preserved. And that black wall served as a place where family members would leave messages. I'm looking for you, to see who was alive. And that wall's still there. So somebody took me there in this book. And it's just a page. So I'm arriving in Italy, I'm arriving at the concentration camp, and you get this flash. It's a flash forward. It's not a flashback, it's a flash forward of this girl taking this Eduardo Halfon to that school. And you don't know. I didn't know what that was when I wrote it. And then that story continues here. So you understand who Aiko is a book later. I didn't know who she was when I wrote her. But I just felt that it complemented it. When talking about one genocide, to mention another mass killing.
Right. I agree. It's very striking in what you're doing, and it's some of us who are here today are involved in a class called Political Violence in the Modern World. You're generously going to visit it tomorrow, and it's a class that brings together different cases each year of political violence and genocide. And this year we happen to be doing the Holocaust, the Guatemalan genocide of the Maya, during the Civil War, and the breakup of Yugoslavia and the genocide in Srebrenica and violence there, and your work just fits so perfectly into what we're doing there, and so I guess I'm not sure even what the question is exactly, but as a critic, this is what I'm looking out for. I'm really interested in these moments where you shift from one to the other, and so I'm curious to hear, and you partly already answered it in talking about the Hiroshima kind of flash forward, as you said. Is this something you're consciously doing? Is there a reason for it, or is it just something that sort of emerges organically?
Yeah, it's not conscious. I'm not conscious of it, Michael. I'm not looking for it, but it's undeniable that it's there, that I'm attracted to that type of drama, that type of trauma. So when I met this pianist, so the Serbian part of my work, the Serbian trip, was because of a pianist I met in Guatemala and who appears in the Polish Boxer. So in the Polish Boxer, there's this story of a friendship between Eduardo Halfon and this Serbian classical pianist who turns out to be a gypsy pianist and who wants to go back to his roots as a gypsy musician. And he disappears. He becomes a ghost, And the story ends there. But then I went to Serbia to look for him. And that is the next book, which is called The Pirouette. And it dives into the genocide in the former Yugoslavia, because that's what I visited, Probably that's part of the reason why I was attracted to that character. Not just the music, not just his dilemma of finding himself, but that he was part of that history, which sort of brought us together. But I felt the same with Aiko, and I feel the same with Guatemala and the Guatemalan genocide. So I'm attracted to those traumas, but I'm not looking for them, or at least not consciously. They're all over my books, though.
Right.
They're all over.
Absolutely. Another, and connected to that, and you're already kind of invoking it here in describing that, is a very literal kind of multi-directionality, which is your narrator figure is always on the move.
Yes.
Right? And there's a strong sense of displacement, I guess I would say, which, I mean, one can see coming out of your biography, I suppose, but I'm not going to try to, I don't mean to imply it comes directly.
It does.
But perhaps it does.
It does.
So, yeah, could you say a little bit about movement, about travel, about this sense of being out of place, of displacement?
Yeah. Well, it's a very Jewish thing.
Also a very Jewish thing.
I mean, yesterday we called it exile at a talk I gave yesterday, but it's really diaspora, what we're talking about. It's just never feeling like you belong. It's a very Jewish way of living, no? Always the suitcase packed, just in case. No? So you're here, but you're not really here. You're not really allowed to be here. We're going to let you be here, but just be prepared to leave. And I think that's very true now in the U.S., more than in the past. So in my case, just in literary terms, I don't have a Dublin, to speak in Joycean words. I don't have a city. I don't have a country. I've never felt that I belong anywhere. I always say that, I left Guatemala when I was 10, the day of my 10th birthday, actually. But I was never there before that. I mean, growing up Jewish in an absolutely Catholic country back then. Now it's Christian, more than Catholic, but back then it was Catholic. And so all of my friends except one or two were Catholics. They were all Catholic. They all had First Communion. They all had Christmas at their houses. They all, the calendar at the school was based on Catholic celebrations. The food that people ate, the fiambre, is all Catholic. So what am I doing there? Because I'm not allowed to play. I can watch from the sidelines, but I'm not allowed to play. And a kid just grows up thinking that you're on the sidelines. You're outside of the country. So I've never been there. I've never been Guatemalan, really. I've never felt it. But I don't feel American either after so many years of being in the U.S.
And you sound remarkably American.
Sound American. I can dress American. Yeah. I took this out of the closet so that I could dress little J. Crewy. So I could play the part and I can sound the part. And when I'm in Spain, my Spanish changes and I sound like Zelig. Remember Zelig from Woody Allen?
Sure.
I physically change, and I can do that in France, and I can't do that in Germany because I don't speak German like you, but I can try.
Yeah.
So this not having a city makes any city a possible backdrop for a story. I can be in LA, I can be in Tokyo, I can be in Belgrade, I can be in Paris, and they're all the same to me. I can use that setting to insert a story. But I have to go. I have to go. I can then write about something else, but I need to go to Poland to write about Poland.
So it does come out of the locations in some way.
Yeah. And I don't really write about what I travel. So I'm not a travel writer. I'm not a journalist. It's not that experience that I want to give you, but I need to smell it and sense it and bring something back with me that I can then give you, which is more emotional than rational. And that's just the way I write. I yearn for a city, Michael. I really want to stay put. I really want to feel at home. I really want to stop moving so much, but it hasn't happened, and I don't think it will. And now I'm educating my son in that same line, which pains me a little because he didn't ask for it, but he's moved. He's 6, and he's moved in 6 years to 6 different countries. He's moved once a year in his life. But yeah, he speaks 4 languages, but it's still a life of boxes, and his toys are still in boxes all the time.
Yeah. Well, we look forward to the Los Angeles version of all of this, if we're lucky, or to having you back for longer.
That would also
be
nice.
nice.
Yes, that would be nice.
Yeah. Let me ask one more big-ish question, maybe invite you to read a little bit more, and then open things up after that to the audience. You have two grandfathers, as many people do, I guess.
In theory.
In theory. I never knew either of my grandfathers, so in fact, you can also have none. But you have two, and I say that because they both play important roles in your work. And we've talked about the Polish grandfather and the connection to the Holocaust, but you also have this Lebanese grandfather, I put it in quotation marks. And that brings out a whole nother side of the family, and it also connects you more or in different ways to Guatemala itself. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about that side of the family and what that brings in? Maybe read us something.
Yeah, I think my Halfon, no? Is Eduardo Halfon, so I have his name. I'm named after my grandfather. Was from Beirut, Lebanese Jew. And it was Japan. It was Japan that actually shifted my writing. When I was invited to that conference. I fictionalized it in that story, but I was invited to that conference. And right after that conference, where I had to come face to face with what it meant to be the grandson of a Lebanese Jew, I wrote Mourning. Mourning is the story, among other things, of his firstborn son. So he who would have been my uncle, Salomon, and who died when he was a kid. He drowned in a lake in Guatemala. And I wrote that when I came back from Japan. I didn't see it. I didn't see the shift from my Polish grandfather to my Lebanese, but that's when it happened. So he starts there. His story starts here. But then I really looked for him in Cancíon. So this is last year's book. And it's the story of his kidnapping. He was kidnapped in 1967. And it's the first time that I write about the Guatemalan Civil War. I'd skirted it. I didn't want to write about it. I didn't want to talk about it for two reasons, Michael. This 36-year war that started in the 60s and was very strong during the 70s, I never felt. We were so sheltered, so overprotected, that we didn't know what was going on. Until that war entered the city, because it had mainly been in the mountains, and then in the late 70s it started coming into the city. And I remember falling asleep to gunfire and suddenly there's a bodyguard following my father, and my dad had a gun, and so I remember the violence creeping in, and then we left. And so the war for me was always a faraway thing. Whether I was living there or living in South Florida, it was always far away, and I didn't want to write about it until I found my grandfather's kidnapper. So I'll read you the beginning of Cancíon, of the story Cancíon. Do we have time for five-ish?
Absolutely.
Okay. They called him Cancíon because he used to be a butcher. Not because he was a musician, not because he was a singer, he couldn't even sing, but because when he got out of jail in Puerto Barrios, where he'd been sent for holding up a gas station, he worked for a time in Doña Susana's butcher shop in a rundown neighborhood in Guatemala City. They say he was a good butcher, very kind to the ladies from the neighborhood who bought cuts of beef and sausages there. And his nickname, then, stemmed from the alliteration between the words in Spanish for butcher, carnicero, and song, Cancíon. Or at least, that's what some of his friends claimed. Others, however, said that he got his nickname thanks to his peculiar melodic way of speaking. And still others, perhaps the most intrepid ones, attributed it to his impulsive way of always confessing too much, of singing more than he should. His closest friends, his comrades, called him Ricardo. But his name was Percy Amilcar Jacobs Fernandez. It was he, Percy, or Ricardo, or Cancíon, who a few years after working as a butcher kidnapped my grandfather. I got there too early. I walked up to the counter and said hello to the bartender, an elderly gentleman dressed in a white shirt and black pants who had probably been there his entire life, behind that same counter, making drinks for those same clients. "What can I get you, caballero?" I was surprised I'd heard him. He mumbled without opening his mouth like a ventriloquist, until I noticed that an almost sepulchral silence reigned in that bar. No music, few patrons. I ordered a negra modelo and went to wait for it at the table farthest from a soundless television that hung from the ceiling. At the table next to me, 2 men were sharing a bottle of rum and a bowl of potato chips. At another table, an older woman, wearing a miniskirt and way too much lipstick, was eyeing the newspaper with little or no interest, possibly just looking at the photos. At another table, a man in the sort of coat and tie typically worn by frustrated notaries was using both hands to hold his glass of whiskey, almost clinging to his glass of whiskey as he observed me with an expression that was serious, indiscreet. I noticed that behind the bar, in an old wooden case with glass doors, were a series of diplomas and gold medals and large silver trophies and a small taxidermied ocelot about to attack. Far away, at the other end of the bar, were the 2 swinging doors to the bathrooms. The men's designated by an old magazine cutout of a young and dusty Clint Eastwood. The women's by an old magazine cutout of a loud and busty Marilyn Monroe. Through the large window, I could see the silhouettes and lights of downtown traffic. It was beginning to get dark. I pulled a small ashtray toward me, lit a cigarette, and stared anxiously at the front door, thinking all the while that a bar located on the corner of a round building is surely a metaphor for something. I was born on a dead-end street. That is, when I was born in 71, my parents lived in a new house on a dead-end street. At the top of the street on Avenida Reforma, there used to be a famous ice cream parlor on one corner and a not-so-famous metal shop on the other. I have no memories of that dead-end street, of course, but several silent home movies serve as evidence of my first years there. Me, as a newborn in my mother's arms, coming home from the hospital in a jade-colored Volvo. Me, as a 1-year-old, sitting in a wooden cart painted sky blue while a black goat pulls me up and down the street and an indigenous boy, barefoot and dressed in rags, guides the black goat with a thin lasso. Me as a 2-year-old, spinning in circles in front of the metal shop with tangerine sorbet on my hand and face, and then, in a foreshadowing of many dizzy spells that were to come, throwing up a tangerine stream all over the curb. Me as a 3-year-old, playing with the neighbor's dog, a fat, lazy dachshund named Sancho. And even though there's no silent home movie of it, or perhaps there is, on a cold January morning in 67, 4 years before I was born, and while our future house was still under construction, a police car stopping my Lebanese grandfather at the top end of the dead-end street, on the corner of Avenida Reforma, to kidnap him. The bartender arrived. He placed the negra modelo in a huge mug on the table, and I asked him if he could bring me a small glass instead. The old man made a face, one of frustration or maybe bewilderment, so I was forced to explain to him that I like to drink beer slowly, pouring one sip at a time in a small glass, whether it be a tumbler or a goblet or a snifter or an old-fashioned. I then thought of telling him to please hurry, since I like to alternate small sips of dark beer with quick drags of my cigarette, although I don't know if it's the bitterness or superstition. I then thought of telling him that the history of my life had become irreparably intertwined with my history of beer and cigarettes, but I remained silent. And the old bartender just made another gesture, only this time a gesture with his entire face, an exaggerated, almost buffoon-like gesture, as if saying, "Yeah, caballero," whatever, but only a madman drinks his beer that way. He snatched the frozen mug from the table and walked back to the counter, dragging his feet. And I shuddered as I saw, out of the corner of my eye, that someone had pushed open the front door. Just a boy, carrying a flimsy cardboard box. He was selling a green parrot. Inside the police car, parked and waiting for my grandfather at the corner of a dead-end street, on that cold morning in January of 67, were 4 men. One was half asleep in the back seat, with a white towel rolled around his neck like a thick scarf. Next to him, Another man was cleaning the window with a page of a previous day's newspaper. Another man, the driver, waited in silence, with the engine running, his hands gripping the steering wheel far too tight. And another man was ready to jump out the passenger door the moment he saw the cream-colored Mercedes in the rearview mirror, coming down Avenida Reforma. Of the four men, only one would survive the Civil War. My grandfather awoke before sunrise. He was anxious, as if he somehow knew what the day held in store for him. He took a shower and dressed slowly, silently, so as not to wake my grandmother. He went down to the dining room and ate breakfast by himself. After making one phone call, he got into his cream-colored Mercedes, started the engine, and drove out through the main gate. It was still early. The dew and the January cold had not yet lifted. My grandfather got to the bank too soon. It was still closed, and he had to wait outside, standing in the almost deserted street. When it finally opened, my grandfather conducted his business angrily, the teller would later state, and went back out to his cream-colored Mercedes. He drove slowly, prudently. Inside one of the front pockets of his trousers was the thick wad of bills he'd just withdrawn from the bank, the equivalent of $2,500, to pay the construction workers their 2 weeks' salaries. Inside the front pocket of his trousers was his bank book, with all of his financial information and current account balance. In his coat's inside pocket were 2 golden pens, and on his pinky finger, as always, he was wearing his 3-carat diamond ring. He got to the dead-end street off Avenida Reforma. There was a police car parked at the top, blocking his way. One of the policemen was already standing on the front gate road and motioned for him to stop and get out of his car. Tiburon. That was the name given by the guerrillas of the rebel forces to the police car used on that cold January morning to kidnap my grandfather. Or rather, the name given to the car they used as the police car. It had belonged to the government's Secretary of Information, Baltasar Morales de la Cruz, who had himself been kidnapped a few months earlier. His son, Luis Fernando, was killed in the shootout, as was his driver, Chabelo. The guerrillas had arrived in a blue truck to kidnap Morales de la Cruz, but it had stalled in a getaway, so they decided to leave the blue truck behind and take Morales de la Cruz in his own car, a chalk-white 1964 Chrysler Imperial Crown. A few months later, that same Chrysler had been painted gray and disguised as a police car and as a shark, and was lying in wait at the top of the dead-end street to kidnap my grandfather. My grandfather got out of his cream-colored Mercedes. He didn't turn off the engine, didn't shut the door, didn't even bother to park it properly in the frontage road of Avenida Reforma, outside of the famous ice cream parlor. It was still early, there were few cars or pedestrians around. The police officer approached, and my grandfather, perhaps because he noticed the policeman's boyish face, or perhaps because he noticed that his uniform was comically large, began speaking to him in an insolent manner. "Move that patrol car," index finger in the air. "Don't touch me," jerking his arm away. But the officer simply said in a calm voice that he had a warrant for his arrest, for contraband. My grandfather, who spoke loudly and brusquely to everyone in his heavy Arabic accent, started speaking even more loudly and even more brusquely to the boyish policeman, who didn't want to or couldn't give him a clear explanation, and who refused to show my grandfather the supposed arrest warrant. But then the policeman said something to him in a whisper, his words barely a curl of white mist, and my grandfather walked with him to the police car and obediently got into the back seat. And sitting there between 2 other policemen, the last thing he saw out of the window was his daughter, my father's eldest sister, racing toward the car. Then everything went black.
It's a story that really has a kind of thriller, like hard-boiled or kind of thriller-like element to it, which you don't necessarily see in a lot of your other work, but it's really striking there.
Yeah, this back and forth between the bar scene, where the narrator's waiting for somebody you don't know who he's waiting for, but he's waiting for somebody, and the telling of the kidnapping in an almost Truman Capote journalistic rebuilding of the facts, or retelling of the facts. So a lot of research, which I'd never done before. But more than that, Michael, a lot of interviews with the people who were involved.
Really?
Yeah, which was very
The
interesting.
kidnappers?
Yeah. Those who accepted, those who were still alive, not all were still alive, but the kidnappers and the planners, which was even more interesting. So I found out many details that my family didn't know, including one, we won't mention this. No, let's not get into it. We'll ruin it.
Some secrets must be maintained.
Yes. No, it's in the book. I just don't want to mention it.
We can open things up for questions now. Yes, in the back.
Let me say, first of all, that I love the humor in your book. I'm glad that you switched to the other grandfather, because in all four books, what I feel is well, not just the Ashkenazi identity, but the Sephardic identity. And some of the family members speak Ladino. I don't remember if you did or not, and it still do. But the fact that it seemed so important as you were growing up, as reflected in all four books, yet you've never gone to any of those countries. You've never gone to Lebanon or to Greece or to Turkey, or you don't write about it anyhow. And I'm wondering, am I making too much?
No, no. It's absolutely. You're absolutely right. You're more right than you know. You're more right than you know, because of my four grandparents, three were Sephardic. So the only Ashkenazi was my Polish grandfather. My paternal grandmother was from Egypt, or her family was from Egypt, from Alexandria. My maternal grandmother was from Aleppo, from Syria. Arab Jews, the three of them, with my Lebanese grandfather. I really want to go to Beirut. I've wanted to go to Beirut for years. I'm a little afraid to go to Beirut. I don't know how possible that is, and it hasn't been necessary to my writing. There's no family left there. There's no family left in Aleppo. There's no family left in Alexandria. So it's really it would be just to go for going's sake. But it is absolutely crucial for me to start looking at my Sephardic side. And you're right, there was a change in perspective, and that was an important point that just happened. I didn't look for it. I think it was the Tokyo invitation that really provoked that.
I was struck, one of the places that the Sephardic influence or culture, I'm not sure how to put it exactly, comes through is in the house,
Yeah.
right, that you describe of your Lebanese grandfather's house, and the food especially really struck me. And this, it's again one of these interesting things about identity or crossing identities or what have you, where there's the cook who you say the cook my Egyptian grandmother had stolen from a Guatemalan restaurant called El Gran Pavo, and whom she'd later trained in the art of Arabic cuisine and the art of Israeli cuisine. So this kind of, again, mixing of cultures and what have you.
See how they're laughing? They remember her. Yeah, so it's Berta. No, yeah. Berta is the best cook I've ever met, because she brought together these two very opposing cuisines. She could make kibbeh naye and lachem bashin and all these great Arabic dishes, but also pepiane, kakik, and all the very Guatemalan atol de lote. But that house, Michael, was just, you remember that house. That house was I call it a palace in the story, because it as a kid, it was a palace, and the smells of the house, not just from the cooking, they would go around every morning with eucalyptus smoke. And it smelled great, and everything that my grandfather brought from Lebanon, and the rugs and the sheshbesh table, and it was just a very, very magical place to grow up as a kid. That house is gone. They tore it down as soon as he died. It's gone. But yes, that comes into play in Cancíon. and what happened at that house during the 70s.
Thanks. Questions? Yeah.
Las abuelas.
Thanks for the reading and thanks for the conversation with Michael. It's been fantastic. I have a question about language. Language is a very important part of that.
Yeah.
And you write about your Polish grandfather, who, as far as I understand, did not only refuse to tell his story, but also refused to speak Polish
Right.
ever again.
Right.
You have told us, and you have also written in some pieces, that you almost lost your Spanish,
Right.
and you kind of refused as well,
Yeah.
right, to
Yeah.
speak in that language. And I am wondering, like, how come you ended up settling into Spanish as your language for literary expression?
By-
Maybe you
yeah.
can tell us a little bit about
Yeah, by mistake. I shouldn't have. Yeah, because when I'm writing, I'm thinking in English. I've been writing for 20 years, and I'm still thinking in English. It's a very bizarre process. My relationship with language is very, very strange. A writer is he who has a struggle with language, Barth said, and I think it's true. I think you have this complicated dance with language as a writer. My mother tongue is Spanish. My first 10 years were spent in Spanish, and then I lost that Spanish. I started getting it back when I became a reader. I think that's reading helped, but what really helped was writing. Was trying to figure out how to tell a story in this language that was mine but wasn't at the same time, and that took some time to learn how to write. The thing, Patricia, is that I'm still stronger in English. I prefer to do these things in English. I prefer to read in English. I write, when I write, I'm thinking in English. There's too much English in my Spanish. Way too much English. I use too many adverbs, which is more allowed in English than in Spanish. They're heavier in Spanish. My comma placement, my adjective placement is still off for Spanish readers. It's a little weird, but it works. I've sort of developed my own private Spanish, which they tell me works. Now, translating. Because I write in English as well. I've written pieces in English, I've written stories in English. There's several in Cancíon that are in English. And I've had to translate in both directions. So sometimes I have to translate something that I've written in Spanish into English, Cancíon. I'm not listed as a translator. This is a secret. Oh, we're being filmed? I'm the third translator. I work with these two great translators, but I'm the third silent, if you will, translator. Because these stories were born in English in my head. They went to Spanish, but now they have to come back to English. And so Danny or Lisa will translate them and give me, I said, no, that's not what was in my head. Yes, but that's what you wrote. Yes, but that's not what was in my head. And it becomes very complicated, no? But when I translate to Spanish, I can't stand it. I suffer. It's really hard for me. But when I translate to English, I love it. It's easy. It's enjoyable. So I have this strange relationship of going back and forth. Now, why? Why did I start in Spanish, which was your question? I don't know, Patricia, if there's an answer to that. I have two possible explanations. One is that I was back in Guatemala. I discovered books and writing while in Guatemala. Yeah? And so I was in Spanish. But there's a prettier answer. And it's not that my mother tongue was in Spanish, but that my childhood was in Spanish. Those first 10 years, and you know this because you've read a lot of my work, those first 10 years are crucial. And I keep going back there to look for things, to look for clues, to why did he drown in the lake? And what about this number on my grandfather's arm? I keep going back to that time, and that time was in Spanish. So if I want to figure something out or find something, I have to do it in Spanish. It's prettier, no? I don't know if it's true, but it's prettier.
Yeah. you speak up a little?
Yeah, I was wondering to what extent I'm serious about this Latin American Jewish writer. Because you know, like all the lyrics and all the bios I see in Guatemala, born writer,
Yeah.
things like that.
Yeah.
I was wondering to what extent do you see yourself in conversation with other Latin American Jewish writers, you know, like from places where there are much more Jews and where being Jewish is not so special now.
Like who? Do you have names in mind?
Well, you know, I mean, like Ana Maria Shua, or
Sure.
or the Argentine writer.
Yeah, there's quite a few in Argentina.
Such big communities that Jewish time,
Yeah.
Jewish school, like
Yeah.
proper Jewish setting.
Yeah.
Or do you think that this kind of your experience is completely different?
Yes, and I'll tell you why. Argentinian Jewish writers like Ana Maria Shua, there's quite a few in Argentina. Mexican Jewish writers, for example, quite a few. Colombian, a couple. Uruguayan, a couple. Those are countries that are very strong in literature. So there is a culture of writing in Argentina, and I'm sure Ana Maria and the rest feel very Argentinian and write about that, or from that point of view. Guatemala, there isn't. There isn't a large Jewish community, 500 families still. That's what we were told always. You know, there's a very, very small Jewish community, and a very limited literary tradition. So I feel more at ease in a Latin American canon than in the Guatemalan. If you try to insert this into the Guatemalan canon, you're not going to be able to. It's very different from what's being written there. In the Latin American canon, it's very different, and that's why putting my books in the Polish literature section makes more sense. There's a Middle Europe sensibility, which is very Jewish, in what I write. That sense of humor, and stylistically, I'm very far away from Latin Americans. I'm closer to Americans, to the American short story writers, in paring it down, in using language that is condensed and direct, very few adornments. So it's very hard to classify this into any of those canons. My feeling, as where do I feel comfortable? In none of them, in all of them, in whichever one you want. If you want to invite me here as a Jewish writer, I will gladly come here as a Jewish writer, or as a Lebanese writer, or as a Latin American writer, or as a Guatemalan writer. When they gave me the prize, the national prize, sure, great.
Yeah, Rebecca.
Thanks so much. I have many questions, but I'll ask one of them. I was curious, what's going on outside?
I don't know, yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more. I didn't know that in between the Spanish and English versions, and I'm assuming
Oh,
the
yeah,
other ones,
yeah.
the order is switched. And one of the things,
Yeah.
I listened to the Polish boxer, and it was kind of fun because you plant seeds that you pick up later.
Yes,
So I was
yes.
wondering, how does it work if that planting gets reordered?
I have to, yes.
How much of that you participate in, and whether that's the editors that are making
No,
this?
I have to do it.
Okay.
I have to do it because that's a great question, and it's such a fascinating answer. It's very complicated. It's very complex. The short version is that every translation of my books, everyone, is absolutely different. So the German, the French, the Italian, the Japanese, the Norwegian, every publisher decides how they want to put this together. Do they want many short books? Do they want one big book? Do they want these two books together and then these two? They tell me what they want for their readers, and then I go home and I put it together. But I don't speak Polish, and I don't speak Japanese, so I have to make changes to the stories in the original. Depending on the content of that book, I have to take this away because I already said it over there. I have to change a title. I have to add a story because if not, it wouldn't make sense. And then give that to the translator and pray that he does his job or her job, because I can't review it. Yeah. So the English versions are closer to me because I'm very involved. Yeah. The English version of The Polish Boxer is actually 2 books. It includes The Pirouette, which in Spanish is a separate book, and it's the trip to Belgrade. Yeah. Mourning is Duelo, which is the Spanish mourning, plus 2 stories of another book. And in this case, work really well together. Cancíon, in English, which we thought was going to finally be the exact same version as the Spanish, I added a chapter that only exists in the English version, and which works perfectly. But I'd written it after I published in Spanish. So yeah? And I could tell you that for every language. Every language is absolutely different. I have this great graphic, which you saw today, of how this works. A Venn diagram, this is the engineer Halfon, of how my books work in different countries and different languages. Now, in short, I'm basically just writing one book. Translations prove that you can put this together in any way you want, and it works. And if you wait just a little longer until I die or until he dies, or one of us has to die, and just put this together, it's one big novel. It's an episodic novel. It's a novel in process. I don't know where it's headed. It was never planned. It's still not planned. So I leave breadcrumbs all the time without knowing which ones of those I will pick up later, which ones I will not, which characters will reappear, which stories will continue, which stories I will contradict, because I love doing that. Give you one version and then give you another. It makes it fascinating for me as well, because I'm also a reader of what's happening here. So it's very complex, but extremely interesting for me.
And also creating a lot of work for literary critics.
That's right.
Especially
That's right.
comparative literary
Well, you're going to have to
critics.
speak 10 languages.
Exactly, yeah. It's not perhaps for me alone, but a collective project to try to reconstruct what's going on and look at the different versions. I mean, it's fascinating, yeah. We probably have time for one more question. Yeah.
I was wondering if this kind of builds off that, what your process is like for writing a short story versus like a more free or longer novel, and how you can write about violence like within the context of a short story versus, or how that might change.
Okay. It's the same process. My process is always the same. It begins every day with a lot of skepticism. There's a huge wall of, what am I doing? Why am I doing this? This doesn't make any sense, this life, To spend your life writing stories that are part invented, part fiction, part biography. What am I doing? Every morning, I have to get past that. Coffee used to help. I don't drink coffee anymore. And my fear of giving up coffee was that I wasn't going to be able to write because I was so used to using it as using caffeine. But it begins there. And eventually, an hour into it, I get into it. And I go back to what I'm working on. And I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know where it's headed. I don't know when it's going to end. Endings always surprise me. So I think I'm headed there and I stop here. And I think that's very much a short story writer's process of letting the story dictate itself. Yeah. How do I know? How do I know when to end? I can't answer that. I'm always asked, and I can't answer that. It's just a feeling, a very, very strong, absolute feeling of it's over. That ending can come later, can come sooner, can be over there, but it always imposes itself. And I always write short pieces, even if I'm writing a longer piece, like Mourning. Mourning is a collection of 43 fragments. And each fragment I write as an autonomous piece. So when I'm working, even if that fragment, as several I read today, are 5 lines long, it has to work as a short story. It has to work, if you just read it by itself, it should do something. But then I have to fit it into the larger structure, yeah, so that it reads along with the other 42. It's placed in the right order. It links to other things in the story. And so there's a almost like a clockwork in those fragments. But my process is just looking at the individual ones, working on those, and then coming in and putting them together. It's a very strange process. It's a very strange process. I think there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of fear because I don't know if what I've spent months on is not going to work, which happens a lot. But that's just that's my way of writing. I don't know how to write it another way.
Okay, well, this seems like a nice place to end with reflections on how you end a story or don't end a story, and on the process of its construction. Thank you so much for sharing with us these insights into your work, into your life, into the relation between your work and your life. It's been a lot of fun, and maybe everyone could join me in thanking once more Eduardo Halfon.
Thank you.